our focus is really the role of religion in the battle space, if we call it that. Looking at the terrorist groups, Al-Qaeda, which I think some of us have studied in considerable depth, most of us would have degrees of experience. Some of us are concerned with battlefield situations, whether Iraq or Afghanistan. Of course, we've had Libya, and currently we are considering the position of Syria. And what exactly is the role of religion in battlefield situations, in counter-terrorism, in counter-insurgency? How do we make sense of what is happening? And so when politicians make their comments, particularly about the Syrian context, how can we better understand what is taking place? It's one thing to know, it's another to understand. In New Testament Greek, there are two words for knowledge, oida and gnosko. Oida is to know with the head knowledge. Gnosko is to know with the heart and with the experience. And what I believe that we will be attempting to do today is to address both entities, to increase your knowledge flow so that you know what is happening, but we want to take you further to help you to understand what is taking place, what are the forces at work, to try to get into the inside. I hope that we can meet both of those two objectives. So without much more ado, I'm going to kick off. Islamic terrorists serve a clear and focused ideology, a set of beliefs in girls that are evil but not insane. Some call this evil Islamic radicalism, others militant jihadism, still others Islamofascism. Whatever it is called, this ideology is very different from the religion of Islam. So said President Bush on the 6th of October 2005. 5 years later, President Obama, in his National Security Strategy of 2010, said, "We reject the notion that Al-Qaeda represents any religious authority. They are not religious leaders. They are killers. And neither Islam nor any other religion condones the slaughter of innocents." Very likely, a distinction is made by both presidents concerning terrorism and Al-Qaeda as a terrorist organization from a religion, the religion of Islam. So likely a distinction is made. The dilemma, though, is, can you dismiss both entities absolutely? Or is one contingent on the other? And I believe that that is where the fundamental difficulty lies. And what I want to do in my paper is really to address that. Understanding a threat is key to being able to counter it effectively. The threat that violent Islamism poses to the West must be understood as a cultural battle, an ideological battle, and a theological battle. A correct understanding of ideology is only possible by means of a correct understanding of the theology that undergirds it. Looking at misunderstanding, one can see one of the reasons that they're behind it. We tended to forget that behind an ideology is a theology. Very interesting, 4 months after 9/11, an individual, we do not know his name, but he produced a book called Through Our Enemy's Eyes, or Osama bin Laden, Radical Islam and the Future of America. is entitled Anonymous, but published by a very reputable publisher. He, in gathering material together, came to the following conclusion. Most Americans, experts, officials, and civilians have still not addressed the role of religion in bin Laden's activities and message in a frank and analytical manner. He went on to say, it's not so much demonizing bin Laden that is important, but how do we understand what actually shaped him and what motivated him? So this issue of how we understand the role of religion in a battlefield context, whether it be fixed battles which we've had to fight in Iraq or Afghanistan, or whether it be in our battles with terrorism, is fundamental. After 9/11, Henry A. Compton, who was Deputy Chief Operations of the CIA Counterterrorist Center, was tasked by President Bush with defeating Al-Qaeda and bin Laden. Compton recalls in his memoir how he considered many Muslims to be America's allies in the struggle against Al-Qaeda and its affiliates. He wrote, "Our focus should be on Al-Qaeda and their affiliates. We must define our enemy in very specific, very narrow terms. This is not a war against Islam. It is just the opposite." And so he goes on. Compton rightly affirms that Muslims must be our allies. But how did he conceive that AQ had emerged from within the wider Muslim culture if he did not address that culture, and in particular the theological basis of that culture? How did he envisage that Muslim allies could defeat them without tackling the religious ideology that motivated and drove bin Laden and his followers? A few weeks after 9/11, Compton attended a briefing with President Bush at Camp David to discuss a strategy for a response against AQ in Afghanistan. After this briefing, the CIA analyst Emil Nachla described the theological impact of AQ on Muslims around the world. Nachla, a Palestinian Christian, had joined the CIA in 1993 and eventually became director of the Political Islam Strategic Analysis Program in the Directorate of Intelligence. He too gave solo briefings to senior policymakers. Nachla's fascinating book and the necessary engagement, written after his retirement in 2006, shows his focus on the ideology of Islamism, but seems not to recognize any link with the theology of Islam itself. He holds that Muslims living in a non-Muslim country should be able to reconcile their faith and their citizenship with these countries. He fails to recognize that in order for them to do that, they either have to abandon the faith or dismiss it as not being important or engage in a massive reinterpretation. Nachla appears to care mainly about whether any particular Islamic group accepts or eschews violence as a method of achieving their goals. He shows little interest in knowing what the goals are, an attitude shared by American policymakers whom he briefed. To focus on the means and not the end is extraordinarily short-sighted. Islamists all share the same aim, the creation of an Islamic state ruled by Sharia, and this is an end result completely incompatible with freedom, equality, or democracy. Daniel Pipes asserts that non-violent Islamists pose a greater threat than the violent ones. Again, Nachla writes much about ideology, but little about theology. Similarly, the 9/11 Commission report recognized that the Al-Qaeda ideology was a root cause of Islamist terrorism, but refused to recognize that the ideology was itself rooted in the classical interpretation of the religion of Islam. I quote, "The enemy is not Islam, the great world faith, but a perversion of Islam. The enemy goes beyond Al-Qaeda to include the radical ideological movements inspired in part by Al-Qaeda that has spawned other terrorist groups and violence. Thus, our strategy must match our means to two ends, dismantling the AQ network and, in the long term, prevailing over the ideology that contributes to Islamist terrorism." Nevertheless, the report uses the word Islam 322 times, Muslim 145 times, Jihad 126 times, and Jihad is 132 times. In other words, it's saying, let's focus on the organizations, the structure. Ideology is there, but let's not grapple with what really is shaping that ideology. Now, Compton was right in asserting that the US and the West are not at war with Islam. And I want to reaffirm that. In no way is the US and her allies in any way involved in a war with Islam as a world religion. The dilemma, though, is this. Once we can affirm that, how do we deal with the interpretations of a religion that deals with violence? At that point, we must address ideas. If interpretations are rooted in hermeneutics, which has to do with how we understand and interpret a particular faith, then we cannot dismiss the faith and religion. We cannot remove it from the equation. So there has to be a battle of ideas, and it has to include theology. So trying to win the battle of ideas without using theology is foolhardy. While in Forrest, who is one of our speakers today, has written, a war of ideas is raging. Nevertheless, behind the war on terror, the outcome of the second is elusively conditioned by the consequences of the first. In any conflict, it is necessary for the general to make his decisions based on realism, not optimism. Unless we recognize the dominant role played by the classical interpretation of Islamic theology in motivating AQ, we impose a serious handicap on our counter-terrorist efforts. Donald Rumsfeld was much mocked in some quarters when in 2002, as Defense Secretary, he sought to distinguish between knowns and unknown knowns. But his realism and his humility in acknowledging the administration's lack of knowledge and understanding and its lack of ability to change other people's thinking should be commended. In 2009, he wrote, "If I were grading, I would say we probably deserve a D or a D minus as a country on how well we are doing in the battle of ideas that is taking place in the world today." In the 9/11 Commission report issued on 22nd July 2004, it had urged the need for the US to use public diplomacy to counter the insurgent ideology. A year later, Karen Hughes, a former television reporter who had been a close advisor to President Bush, was appointed to head up efforts to achieve this, despite the fact that she appears to have had no background knowledge of Islamic theology, of the Islamic theology and ideology that she needed to counter. The lack of success in American public diplomacy in changing Islamist ideas can be attributed in part to at least to the irrelevance of some of the methods attempted. For example, the Radio Sawa, a 24-hour Arabic language service which in 2002 was launched to replace Voice of America, 12-hour content-rich Arabic service. What did he do? Play pop music, both Arab and Western. Robert Riley, again one of our speakers, commented on the situation. He said, in a war of ideas, performing a lobotomy on your enemy might be a good move. It is almost unheard of to perform a lobotomy on yourself and then declare it a success. How would you like to have a superpower adolescent in your neighborhood? Took a lot of courage for him to say that. So, what evolved? 3 elements of engagement, addressing 3 arenas. One was homeland security, and they need to develop a counter-terrorist strategy. The second, having to address the Muslim world, and so a strategy of engagement that had to do with public diplomacy. And the third, the battlefield situations where our forces found themselves on, and here particularly with the development of a counterinsurgency program, COIN, then they had to look at how they would engage the religion as well as the ideology. Now, as we saw earlier, that religion was embedded in the CIA from a very early period, in fact, particularly from 1996. It seems also likely that in religion was played a part in the thinking of the FBI at a very early period. Ali Sufa, who was an FBI agent, addresses the issues of ideology and how he has sought to convince his own masters that they had to look at ideology. And he, in a recent article, argued very strongly that the US had failed to address the issue of ideology. But I believe he himself makes a mistake. For when he looks at ideology, he sees it mainly as dealing with how the West is perceived. He looks at issues of alienation. What he does not do is address the issues of the theological underpinning of the ideology. So I would argue that they developed no overarching strategy, either short-term or long-term. Now, over the years, experts were brought in to advise both President Bush and President Obama on how the US should engage with the Muslim world, on how it should deal with Al-Qaeda. These included academics, politicians, military, and even retired missionaries. Yet, despite all these efforts, it is difficult to see a clear strategy emerging which would address the terrorist threat being faced in the US and to develop both a counter-terrorist and a counter-insurgency policy to respond to the situation in the Muslim world, where some governments were allied to Islamist extremism, where in some Islamist extremism was fast taking hold and developing, and to battlefield situations. And of course, the US had to have partners, and so strategies began to develop, both within the UN, organizations like the OSCE, and other international entities. The difficulty was, how do you develop a long-term strategy, particularly in a country like the US? Different contexts require different solutions. Politicians are there only for a fixed period, so they can't plan 20 years ago. They can't create structures which can outlast them, but the strategies can change. So multiple approaches have been developed depending on the context and the time period, but I would argue it left the US vulnerable to uncertainty about how exactly to deal with AQ and Islamist extremism. And may I say, you see this just a few days ago in Mr. Kerry's recent statement about the presence of Al-Qaeda in Syria, or the non-presence of Al-Qaeda in Syria. Now, they developed also a strategy of separating violent and non-violent Islamists. Here the problem is a confusing one. The Brookings Institute argued very strongly in 2010 that the US was in a state of confusion in addressing the issue of Islamism, and urged a major shift in policy so that the US would engage with non-violent Islamists. So at this point in time, the thinking was, we can't address Islam. We're now dealing with terrorists, and there's an ideological basis. So we've now got Islamists or political extremist Islam. Is it possible to focus on the extremists, divide them into two, into the non-violent extremists, the violent extremists, support the non-violent extremists politically so they can take power, i.e. Morsi, and then use them to neutralize the non-violent, the violent extremists. So the idea here was to strengthen relationships with non-violent extremists and to potentially look to them coming to power to achieve stability in their countries and regions. I believe this was a very dangerous policy to engage in, and to a degree it still shapes US policies, particularly with reference to Saudi, Qatar, and what has happened recently in Egypt. So we end up engaging with the wrong kinds of Muslims. Instead of dealing with those that share our values, shares our ethos, our fundamental principles, we engage and back those who seek our destruction. We also found ourselves in the US following an outdated British model, which I won't go too much into. The UK developed not a homeland security, but a program, a strategy known as Contest. When Mr. Obama wanted to look at where the US to go, he went to the UK, brought over one of the principal parts of Contest. The only problem was, when Mr. Cameron came to power, he rejected Labour's understanding of contest because it didn't work. In fact, it bolstered the Islamists. And Mr. Obama brought over the defective version, which is now enshrined in the counter-terrorist strategy. So you can begin to see the dilemma, even using the position of General Petraeus, who argued very much for culture, and then suggesting the reconciling the reconcilables, neutralizing the irreconcilables, utilizing Kilcullen, his three pillars of insurgency. There is no mention of religion. So the issue of misunderstanding religion by taking a secular approach became, I believe, quite fundamental to how the US began to understand the role of religion in over the past 12 years or so. I think part of this reason had to do with secularization. Alan Judd, in a review of Peter Bergen's book Manhunt, From 9/11 to Fatabad, pointed out that not only do secularists struggle to understand the immensely formative power of personal religious belief, but also those who do it grasp its potency are quickly in danger of paralysis and despair, as there seems no effective way to respond. Quote, there has been a tendency in the British bureaucracy, at least now it's in the US also, to play down the religion and to play up everything else. This is partly because a secular culture finds it difficult to comprehend true religious enthusiasm, and partly because if you do admit it, you can see no end to it. There's nothing to negotiate. So we ended up engaging with non-violent extremists. In 2005, SIOPS began to take off here in the US. The Department of Defense issued a directive concerning stability ops, which were to be provided primarily by the US Army Civil Affairs and Psychological Operations Command, commanded at that time by Major General Herbert Al-Shuler. Al-Shuler described his unit's mission as the bridge between the military command on the ground and the civilian population in its area of operations, including population, leadership, elected, appointed, institutions, and culture. The religion is not mentioned, but culture is mentioned. So religion was put under culture, and it was embedded in SIOPS, which then became a part of Stratcom. And I believe this had serious implications. Just very briefly, Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, we had the development of an engagement with religious entities. For civic purposes, we needed to engage with things like Hajj, provide during Ramadan, people to get there safely during Ramadan, to ensure heating, electricity at critical times, provision of fresh meat, and a whole host of other areas. But we went further. We needed to engage with the ulama and leaders, so we had to engage with them. With the ulama, we actually paid them to write fatwas, which we then paid for to be circulated on media, press, etc. So we became vitally involved in the whole press process of using religion, both positively to bring the population inside, but also in terms of kinetic to neutralize the opposition. Similarly in Iraq. Iraq began to use religion, for example, the mosque listening service on Friday to ascertain whether a jihadist message was actually going out. The distinction between Sunni and Shia, times and dates of the Muslim calendar, where likely attacks might come. People like Muqtada al-Sadr, how he could be neutralized. When we came to Libya, what did we do? Because we were to distance, we used surrogates. In this case, Saudi and Qatar. So we ended up not defining the nature of the enemy. So those whom we began to back, arm, and train turned out to be the religious fanatics who took control with their various militias after Gaddafi fell, including IQ. And I believe we are now in a very similar situation in Syria, where I think your president, and in particular Mr. Kerry, has totally underplayed the significance of Saudi and Qatar, the significance of al-Nusra and the al-Qaeda elements. And so we are in a very strange alliance now with the very people that wants to destroy us. Of course, throughout this period of time, a variety of responses have been made. For example, encourage Muslims to return to the Muhammad and the Quran, because violence came with Armenia in the 13th century. Encourage Muslims to return to the Sharia, then they're going to be better people and not killers. Create a new lexicon, in other words, define religious terminology so it is not used against us. Reject all linkage between Islam and violence. Embrace the extremists in order to kill the terrorists. We've gone through these, but they've produced very little. Also, there have been factors which have controlled our thinking, how we should respond. Political correctness, post-colonial guilt, wishful thinking, wars in the Islamic world influencing our policy decisions, misguided attempts to gain popularity in the Muslim world, the priority of searching for quick fix. In all of this, too, the military has had its own difficulties. They could not really develop a coherent long-term strategy. They didn't have the personnel to do it. They could not be seen to be actively engaged in Islam because it could be counterproductive. You needed top secret security clearances. Where would you find them? We simply did not have them. A whole host of areas that hampered the processes of the military in developing a coherent strategy on religion. So looking at where we are today, I would say there is an accidental engagement with Islamists that is currently taking place. Without realizing it, we're finding ourselves in bed with the Islamists and, sadly, with AQ, the very organization we want to destroy. I'm not going to deal much with ideology. Others will deal with it. I have a very lengthy paper, and you'll read it there. Except to quote Sahawiri. He said this, who is the brother of the AQ leader. So, sorry, Muhammad al-Zakir. The strength of AQ is not in its leaders, but in its ideology. Doesn't matter how many we kill. The ideology is what is now embedded within the hearts and minds of many there. So let me come quickly to my conclusion. I believe that American experience teaches us much of its history. I believe you had to fight three religious groups: the Native Americans, the Civil War, and the American War Revolution. Take with the Native Indians. It was a theological conflict. The Puritans entering New England saw themselves entering Canaan. They developed a theological justification for the suppression, if not the extermination, of the American Indian, because it followed the pattern of the book of Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. So you had an argument, how do you interpret Scripture at that point? When you come to the American Revolution, there's also a theological undergirding. The Anglican Church looking to the role of the monarchy, the divine right to rule. There you've got Presbyterian congregations, others, interpreting Romans 12. If the magistrate is not good, you can actually overthrow him. So you had a theological conflict. Apostasy for the Anglican Church, supporting the revolutionary cause. Even a twisted interpretation of Scripture, where David is seen to be the bad king and Absalom is hung by David, and it is the revolutionary Absalom who wants to overthrow the kingdom. We've been there before. When you come to the Civil War, slavery, both sides interpreting Scripture to seek their own particular positions. The US had the backdrop of that history, and I believe that what happened in time, you learned to deal with theology and with weird theological interpretations. And you brought into being a theology based on freedom, values and virtues, and faith. And a faith that was separated from the state. And out of that, you created the kind of society today, which is the model of the world. I don't recognize that. And so my way forward is really 4 very simple points. Firstly, study and learn from the lessons of American history. A theological justification used by devout American Christians with regard to their responses to Native Americans, such as Negro slaves, white rulers, etc., with fuel violence. Well, learn from that. Secondly, having recognized this, refrain from facilitating the dissemination of Islamist theology and ideology, which means we have to look at our relationships with Saudi and Qatar that are proponents of those ideologies. Thirdly, make proactive efforts to deconstruct this ideology and theology. The best way to do this is to support and strengthen the liberal movements. Fourthly, disable the institutions and individuals who propound this ideology by whatever means possible. I have 2 minutes. Let me conclude. An ideology that is derived from religion should not be treated as a no-go area for American policymakers. Indeed, the US is uniquely able to help the 20th century Islam cut itself off from its Islamist accretions by sharing with Muslims the lessons that America herself has learned in the last 400 years about finding theological support for horrifying injustices and violence. I would say our message, I'm not an American, but if I was an American, my message would be simply this: learn from us. This learn from us is a message of humility, not of pride. If the full message runs, we have been there. We got it wrong. We put it right. Learn from our mistakes. Thank you.